The first time I saw the boy, he was standing at the end of the long hallway in my grandmother's house in rural Vermont. I had been sent there for the summer, a restless 16-year-old from Boston, exiled to the quiet, ancient clapboard house with its creaking floors and the scent of dust and potpourri. My grandmother, a kind woman with a face like a roadmap of forgotten decades, told me the house had been in our family for over a century. I remember looking at her and thinking about how much history was packed into those walls. How many people had walked these same floorboards? It was a beautiful place, a big old farmhouse surrounded by fields that rolled into thick woods. But there was a weight to it, an unspoken quiet that felt heavy, almost suffocating. That first night, as I lay in the guest room, the stillness of the countryside was a foreign language to my city-slicker ears. No sirens, no traffic, just the chirping of crickets and the groan of the old house settling. It was in that deep silence that I saw the boy. He wasn't solid, more like a wavering heat haze, but I could make out the shape of him. A small boy in what looked like turn-of-the-century clothes, a little suit with short pants. He was just standing there, unmoving, and then as I blinked, he was gone. The next morning, I chalked it up to being over. New house, new sounds, a strange dream. But over the next few days, the presence lingered. It was a feeling more than a sight. A chill that would sweep through a room for no reason, even on a hot August afternoon. The inexplicable feeling of being watched when I was alone in the library. Or a fleeting movement I'd catch in my peripheral vision in the upstairs hallway. My grandmother was oblivious, bustling about her day, humming to herself, and tending to her garden. I didn't want to worry her, so I kept it to myself. I spent my days exploring the woods behind the house, trying to outrun the feeling of unease that had taken root in my stomach. The woods were dense and beautiful, a place that felt as old as the house itself. There was a small, neglected cemetery on the edge of the property line, with a handful of weathered headstones from the late 1800s. I read the names, trying to imagine the lives they had lived, a few of them children who had died young. I remember finding one tiny stone with the name Thomas and a date from 1898. It was a simple grave, no more than a small moss-covered rock. It gave me a strange, profound sadness. The activity escalated. The faint, rhythmic tapping I'd heard on my first night returned, a soft, persistent thud against the wall beside my bed. It would start just after I turned off the light, slow and steady, like a small fist knocking from the other side. I moved my bed away from the wall, but the tapping followed. It wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from within the room. The first night this happened, I pulled the sheets over my head, heart hammering against my ribs, convinced it was just my imagination. The second night, I finally mustered the courage to sit up and listen. The sound seemed to be coming from the antique wardrobe in the corner. I crept over to it, my hands shaking as I reached for the brass handle. I pulled it open and saw nothing but old moth-teen coats and dusty blankets. The tapping immediately stopped. I slammed the door shut and scrambled back to bed, a cold sweat beating on my forehead. The following nights, the phenomena became bolder. I'd be reading a book in the living room, and a porcelain teacup would slide an inch across the mantelpiece. I'd come out of the bathroom to find a chair at the dining table pulled out, as if someone had just gotten up. The unsettling feeling of being watched was no longer a feeling. It was a certainty. I could feel eyes on my back, a breath of cold air on my neck. I started to talk to the empty spaces in the house, a low whisper of, "Leave me alone," or "What do you want?" The boy, the heat haze. I saw him more often now. He wasn't just in the hallway. I'd see him in the reflection of a window, standing just behind me, or a flash of his little suit disappearing around the corner. He never made a sound, never moved with any urgency. He just was, a quiet, persistent reminder that I was not alone. The fear was no longer a panicked flight response. It was a slow, creeping dread that permeated every moment of my day. Every corner of the old house, the climax of it all happened on a rainy Tuesday. The storm had knocked out the power, and the house was plunged into a heavy, oppressive darkness. My grandmother had gone to bed early, so I was alone downstairs, trying to read by the light of a single flickering candle. The silence, normally so unnerving, was now filled with the sound of the storm. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. I heard a sound from upstairs, a distinct and unmistakable thud. I froze, the book forgotten, in my lap. It wasn't a settling sound. It was the sound of a heavy object being dropped on the floor. It came from my grandmother's room, directly above me. I slowly stood, my body screaming at me not to go. But my grandmother was old, and I couldn't just sit there. I grabbed the candle and started up the stairs, the flame casting long, dancing shadows that made the banister look like a skeleton's fingers. The air grew colder with every step, and the scent of old dust was replaced by a cloying, earthy smell, like a fresh grave. When I reached the top, the hallway was a tunnel of blackness. I held the candle high and saw it. At the end of the hall, right outside my grandmother's bedroom door, was the boy. But this time he wasn't a haze. He was solid. His face was pale and dirt-streaked. His eyes were wide and black, and he was holding something, a small, rusty spade. He looked at me, a silent, hollow gaze, and then his mouth opened, a wide, unnatural circle, and from it came a sound that didn't belong to a human throat, a low guttural shriek that was part wind and part something else, something deeply ancient and wrong. The scream seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards, and the candle in my hand went out, plunging me into absolute darkness. I don't remember running down the stairs. I don't remember scrambling to the front door. The next thing I knew, I was on the porch, the rain soaking my clothes, gasping for air, as if I had been underwater for a week. I didn't go back into that house. Not that night, or ever again. My grandmother, confused and concerned, called my parents, who drove up in the middle of the night to get me. I tried to explain, but the words sounded like nonsense, even to my own ears. They just saw a scared, shivering boy, and a house that had simply lost power. My grandmother still lives there, and she says she doesn't believe in ghosts. But every time I talk to her on the phone, she mentioned the strangest things. An old teacup she finds moved on the mantel, or a chair she swears she didn't pull out. She tells me, with a nervous laugh, that she just must be getting old and forgetful. But I know the house isn't empty, and I know the boy is still there, still waiting, still playing his long, slow game in the silent, suffocating dark. Growing up in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, our lives revolved around the sun. Everything was bleached out and dry, the air so still and hot, it felt like a physical presence. The one escape we had from the suffocating summer heat was the basement. Our house was a 1970s ranch style, and the previous owner, a retired military man, had dug out a full basement as a kind of self-sufficient bomb shelter. It was an oddity in our neighborhood, where most houses were built on slabs. The entrance was a narrow, steep staircase off the kitchen, and it was always at least 20 degrees cooler down there. We used it for storage, a place to throw old Christmas decorations and boxes of my dad's forgotten books. But my brother, Marc, and I turned it into our own kingdom. We'd set up a rickety card table and a couple of beanbag chairs, a small TV with a VCR, and spend entire days down there. Escaping the brutal heat, the low drone of the central air conditioner, our constant soundtrack, we'd watch old horror movies and play card games. The air thick with the smell of damp concrete and something else, something musty and sour that we just attributed to old age. I remember one time, Marc jokingly called it the dead air room because the air felt so heavy, so still. The basement was our little haven, a place of peace and cool darkness, a sanctuary from the relentless Arizona sun. The first oddity was the radio. It was a cheap, battery-powered thing we used to listen to the Diamondbacks games. We'd leave it on the card table, and every so often, without anyone touching it, the station would switch. Not just a little staticky flicker, but a clean jump to a different channel, often a religious station or a country one. We'd joke about a ghost being a fan of old gospel hymns, but it was just a strange quirk. Then the TV started doing it. It wasn't connected to cable. We only used it for VHS tapes. But sometimes, when it was off, the screen would flicker to life with a blast of white noise. A blank, humming screen full of static. We'd flip the power switch, and it would go off, only to turn on again a few minutes later. Mark and I started a game, timing how long it would take for the ghost TV to turn itself on. The first time the VHS player ejected a tape on its own, a tape of The Exorcist no less, we started to get a little creeped out. It was no longer a quirky ghost. It was a presence that seemed to be actively engaging with our technology. We talked to our parents about it, but they were convinced we were just being dramatic. My dad went down and unplugged the TV and the radio, but that didn't stop the humming. Even with the power cut, a low, continuous static hum would sometimes fill the room. It was like the very air was charged with some kind of unseen energy. Then things started to get more personal. The hum became more frequent, and a faint whisper started to accompany it. I'd be sitting at the card table, reading a comic book, and hear my name called. So soft and low, it sounded like it was coming from inside my own head. Jess. It was never loud enough to pinpoint, never distinct enough to prove. It was just there, a spectral murmur. Mark heard it too. We started to get jumpy, glancing at the stairs, half expecting someone to come down and explain the weirdness away. The whispers evolved, becoming full sentences. Though still so quiet and distorted, it was hard to make them out. Get out. You're not welcome. They sounded like they were spoken in slow motion, drawn out and stretched thin. One evening, Mark and I were playing cards and the hum grew louder, filling the whole basement with a vibrating energy. The card table began to shake, just a subtle tremor at first. But then the cards on the table began to slide and fall off onto the concrete floor. Mark and I looked at each other, our eyes wide with a shared, unspoken fear. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were a cacophony of distorted, overlapping voices, all speaking at once, unintelligible and enraged. The hum was so loud now, it was physically painful, a pressure in our ears. I remember Mark grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the stairs, his face pale and contorted with fear. As we ran, we heard something behind us. Not a voice, not a hum, but a sound like scraping, like something heavy being dragged across the concrete floor. We didn't look back. We didn't dare. The climax came the following week, after our parents insisted we were just imagining things and we needed to go back down to face our fears. We went reluctantly, armed with a flashlight and a heavy-duty camping lantern. The moment we stepped onto the bottom stair, the basement door at the top slammed shut behind us. We fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. The static hum was immediate and overwhelming, and the whispers were louder, clearer, and more malicious than ever. The light from the camping lantern flickered violently, casting long, dancing shadows. Suddenly, a figure materialized in the middle of the room, standing right in front of the TV. It wasn't a solid person, more like a flickering screen, a man made of pure static and white noise. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and I could just make out the dark, angry shapes of his eyes. His voice, a grating, electronic roar, filled the room. "I told you to get out," he bellowed. The air around him was cold and smelled like ozone. He raised a hand, and the card table we'd been playing on years earlier lifted into the air and was hurled across the room, smashing into a wall. The man made of static advanced on us, his form flickering and pulsing with an eerie internal light. Marc yelled and tried to push me toward a small window, our only other way out, but the static man was faster. He reached for Marc, and for a split second, I saw his hand. It wasn't a hand, but a claw, a black, jagged thing made of pure darkness. I don't know how we got out. I have a vague, disjointed memory of Marc smashing the glass of the window well with his elbow, and us scrambling out into the scorching Arizona sun. We ran to our neighbor's house, incoherent and terrified. My parents, after calming us down, went to inspect the basement. They found the card table shattered against the far wall, and a jagged black scorch mark on the concrete floor where the static man had stood. They never said anything about it again. My parents sold the house a month later. We never saw the man again, but the hum followed us. Sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I can still hear it, a faint low buzz that feels like a whisper. And every time I hear it, I'm reminded of the angry man made of static, a ghost who didn't want to haunt, but to live, and who was willing to do anything to get us out of his dead air room. I was a caretaker for old houses in rural upstate New York. I got the job through my uncle. He managed a handful of historical properties for a preservation society. Most of the time it was a quiet job, just keeping the pipes from freezing and making sure the squirrels hadn't found a new way into the attic. But one of the properties was different. It was an old Victorian, a massive, turreted thing on a hill overlooking the Hudson River. The owner, a reclusive artist named Silas, had left it to the society with the stipulation that it be maintained exactly as it was. I was tasked with being the sole caretaker. The house itself was a museum of a life. Every room was filled with Silas's creations, intricate clockwork automata, strange brass telescopes pointed at the ceiling, and paintings of unsettling, empty landscapes. The air was heavy with the smell of old wood, dust, and something else, something metallic and sharp like ozone. My job was just to be there, to keep the place from falling apart. I didn't mind the solitude. The quiet felt like a blank canvas. But as the winter nights grew long, I started to feel like the house wasn't just old. It was observing me. The first month was uneventful, but then I began to notice things. Small, impossible things. I'd be in the library, and a book I'd just placed on a shelf would be back on the desk, its pages open and ruffled. I'd come downstairs in the morning to find the antique parlor chairs arranged in a circle, as if they were holding a silent meeting. It was subtle, almost ghastly. I started to take photos of every room before I left it, just to prove to myself I wasn't losing my mind. The pictures were always the same, but the reality was not. My most unsettling discovery was with the grandfather clock in the main hall. It didn't work. The pendulum was still, the hands frozen at 12:03, but every night, I'd come out of my room and the clock would be ticking. Just for a moment, a low rhythmic tick-tock that would stop the second I focused on it. I'd approach it, put my ear to the glass, and nothing. Silence. But I knew what I had heard. The house felt like it was playing a long game, a slow, methodical test of my sanity. The presence wasn't hostile, not yet. It was more like an infestation of boredom, a mischievous, unknowable intelligence that found amusement in rearranging my world and making me question my own memories. The escalation was a slow, creeping dread. It began with the paintings. The landscapes, which I had initially found just unsettling, began to change. Small, imperceptible things at first, a new shadow on a distant hill, a faint shape in the sky. Then, one night, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In a painting of a barren field, a single, tiny figure had appeared. It was in the far distance, a stick-like shape with a disproportionately large head. staring out of the canvas and directly at me. I stood there, frozen in the hall, my flashlight beam trembling on the framed image. I felt my stomach clench with a deep, primal fear. From that night on, the figures in the paintings moved. I'd walk past a portrait of a stern-looking man and see his eyes follow me. I'd catch a glimpse of the stick figure in the corner of my eye, in a different painting, closer to the foreground. The house was no longer just rearranging furniture. It was actively changing the reality within its walls. I tried to cover them with blankets, but by morning, the blankets were on the floor, and the unsettling figures were there, watching me, moving closer. I stopped sleeping in my room and started to sleep on the sofa in the living room. A heavy axe I found in the shed propped up beside me. The ticking of the grandfather clock was constant now, a maddening rhythm that permeated the entire house, even when I couldn't consciously hear it. It was no longer a trick. It was the beat of the house's cold, malevolent heart. The climax arrived on a frigid night when the wind was so loud against the windows it sounded like a frantic whisper. I was in the living room, trying to force myself to read a book, the axe by my side, when I heard a distinct sound from the main hall. Not the ticking, but a deep, resonant hum, like a gear turning. I crept out of the living room, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, and saw it. The grandfather clock, which hadn't worked in decades, was in motion. The hands were spinning, not ticking, but a continuous, accelerating whir. The pendulum swung wildly, a blur of motion. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through the floorboards. I was about to turn and run when I heard a low, grating sound coming from the clock's face. The hands had stopped spinning and were now moving backward, slowly, deliberately. The minute hand moved to the 11, then the 10, then the 9. The clock wasn't just working, it was reversing time. The humming sound intensified, and the air around the clock began to shimmer, a thick, coiling haze. From within the haze, a shape began to form. It was a man, indistinct and wavering, like a mirage, but I could make out the sharp outline of his face, the dark pits of his eyes. He looked like the artist, Silas, but his face was contorted into a silent shriek of pure, agonizing rage. He was trapped in the clock, and he was staring at me, his mouth open, screaming a scream that had no sound, just a wave of pure psychic terror that hit me with the force of a physical blow. The air around me grew impossibly cold, and I felt the presence of 1,000 unseen eyes watching from the shadows, a silent audience to the man's suffering and my terror. I ran from that house, and I never went back. I left the job, and I didn't bother to explain why. I just called my uncle and told him I couldn't do it anymore. He didn't push. He just told me he had an idea that something like this might happen one day. I don't know what happened to the house. I don't know if it's still standing or if someone else is living in it. I don't know if they can still see the figures in the paintings or if they hear the unending tick-tock of the clock. But I know that somewhere in that old Victorian, a man is trapped, reliving a moment of pure, silent agony for all eternity, and the house itself is his warden, his jailer, and I know the house will never stop. It's too old to ever forget.